Peter has, just very quickly, he is now covering the Trump administration as, I believe, your fourth presidency. Is that right? So we got a guy we've got a lot of experience on the stage in terms of covering the White House. And so since we're supposed to be talking about the first 100 days, and the four of us are, in some respects, the most contemporary part of this conversation, I think, or a contemporary part of it, I think we ought to go straight to Peter and just say, we're at, what, 84 days? We couldn't decide backstage, depending on how you count it, of the Trump administration. Whether you like it or don't like it, it feels like more like 84 months, I think, at this stage. But Peter, we're approaching 100 days. Give us the report card.
Well, thank you very much for having me. First of all, I'm thrilled to be here. A native Virginian, I applied to UVA, didn't get in, so for me this is a great treat.
Well, these things happen.
Finally to be here.
Blame that on Senator Warner.
But, look, this is unlike every presidency we have seen. I think that it's not too far. Reporters go too far sometimes. We stretch and we exaggerate. My partner, when I started on the White House beat 20 years ago, said the job of a White House reporter is to simplify then exaggerate. And we do that. And the great thing about this presidency, from a journalistic point of view, is we don't need to exaggerate, because all the things that are happening are just things you could never have imagined. They're mind-snapping. They're I used the word whiplash in the paper the other day. I think that the grades, you want to give him grades, I'm not going to give you grades, but I think you can clearly say in the first 100 days he's not going to do what other presidents have done and had a major piece of legislation. That's not happened so far. But he has gotten a Supreme Court justice confirmed. That's not usually done in the first 100 days, and he did so rather smoothly, and one that's well-liked by his conservative base and respected by the other side of the aisle. And he has set the agenda. I think what he's done most successfully and most clearly in this 84 days or whatever it is to dominate the conversation. All we talk about in Washington, and I think other parts of the country, is Donald Trump. It's very hard to find a radio station that isn't talking about Donald Trump. It's very hard to have a conversation in Washington, at least, that doesn't flow around Donald Trump, for better or worse.
Well, so, and by the way, I know you're a print guy, but hold the microphone a little closer to your mouth the next go around. There we go. I want to make sure everybody hears every word you got. One more thing to you, Peter, before we move into a little broader discussion. And unfortunately, we didn't get to hear the backstory, guys, a few minutes ago. So if they've already talked about this, or if we go into anything that somebody has already talked about, just boo gently, and we'll move on, okay? But if they didn't go into this, the whole 100 days obsession goes back to, I think, FDR, 1933, one of his fireside chats in July of that year, and he's talking about his first 100 days, his and the 73rd Congress, though it's already at about 140 days. He's conveniently bringing up the report card after he knows he's done really well. But he had already pushed through Congress 15 major pieces of legislation that radically changed the structure of government over the next generation, reordered American society. I mean, you can't have accomplished anything more. President Trump, as you've just said, has set an agenda. He's got a Supreme Court justice through, but in terms of legislation, really nothing of great consequence has made it through yet. So, but is that typical? Or, I mean, who is most like or most different from the impossible standard established by Franklin Delano Roosevelt?
I think there's one thing that every president since FDR agrees with each other on, is they all hate FDR for having set this standard in the first place. Not just because he was good at it, but because, in fact, it's sort of an artificial thing. Why do I have to get everything done in 100 days anyway? Part of the reason, of course, is you want to get momentum. You want to take advantage of the goodwill that you have as a new president. You've just come off an election. You've just come off, presumably, an inauguration that was successful. And you want to tap into the unity that sometimes follows that. This is a different moment in our history. There is no unity. And President Trump had no honeymoon, let's face it, okay? Whether it's his fault or other people's fault or a mix, he had no honeymoon. And so this 100 days construct, in some ways, of course, is completely artificial. Democrats have adopted it more than Republicans. Republicans have really resisted it over the years, I've found, because they don't like getting caught into this idea. Passing legislation is not necessarily a Republican thing. I mean, their idea is to scale back government, not build on government, so that the measurements are different. And what I think President Trump would tell you is he has taken a lot of action through executive power that has at least set the stage for future things. So I think he has, in fact, set a course forward.
So, Nikki, jump in on the idea of you're an expert both on conservative media, but also you're an active commentator on current events and a columnist for U.S. News, and so you're in the game of these things. But from your perspective as a historian, how different is the Trump presidency thus far? Is it really a dramatic change from the past, or is it just that he's using new technology aggressively in a way that, I mean, FDR was using new technology aggressively when he did the fireside chats on radio?
Sure. I don't think that the technology is the thing that makes him an unusual or a different president. It's that he doesn't have a core philosophy that he shares with his party. And that is something that's really different. But he also doesn't have a core philosophy. And that has actually been something that we've seen over the course of these 100 days. I mean, if the 100 days idea is that you're going to pass all of this legislation that you've been promising on the campaign trail, and then you change all of your positions from the promises you made on the campaign trail, that's a big deal. And I think that that's what makes it difficult to assess what his first 100 days are like. We can also say, just by metrics, it's very, very different from recent history. Most presidents in their first 100 days have approval ratings that are higher than their vote percentage. So if you won by 52%, you'll have an approval rating of like 64, 65%. Every president, since they've been keeping track of these approval ratings, has had that honeymoon period where they have a higher approval rating than their vote totals. Donald Trump actually has a lower approval rating than his vote totals. He won 46% of the vote, and his approval ratings have bounced between the mid-30s and the low 40s. So he's actually lost support in the time period between the election and coming into office. And so I think that that's a very different environment. And then he has a fractured Republican Party, and that's not on him. It's that the Republican Party that would be helping him get this legislation passed isn't on the same page with one another.
And it's also interesting, too, though, that in the interview that we all saw, or some of us saw, that the president gave to Maria Bartiromo, now of Fox News, that broadcast yesterday, it was interesting, though, that President Trump made reference to the fact that, I'm paraphrasing, but he said, we've got the House and the Senate and the White House, and so we're all set. You know, we can do whatever we want, you know, and which is fascinating. I mean, that's what FDR had back in 1933 as well. But the idea that doesn't actually add up, that doesn't seem to mean anything even remotely close to what it might once have seemed to mean.
Well, and I think the or the AHCA bill is evidence of that, right? Here you have this unified Republican government that doesn't actually lead to Republican legislation, and that has to do really not with Trump so much as it has to do with the divisions in the Republican Party, and that's become kind of a barrier, at least on those issues. And I should say, he has a low approval rating, but he has a very high approval rating among Republicans, and I think that's down to things like Neil Gorsuch and being able to fulfill some of those promises.
Russell, you've done these hundreds of hours of interviews with all of these different members of the various administrations since Jimmy Carter. I mean, it's a very unique sort of perspective that you have as a scholar and an academic, and this very more methodical approach, and actually somebody who's covered so many administrations in a way that typically a journalist would not have sort of the span of time that you've done. But so how do you see how things have unfolded as they relate to the presidencies that you've studied so closely?
I think the first thing to say about this is it's very hard to know exactly from the outside how things are going on the inside. I mean, we're getting an awful lot of terrific reporting, but it's hard to know based on that reporting what to believe and what not to believe in terms of where the fissures are and how well people are getting along, whether some of what the president doing is by plan or artifice, and whether it's just by accident. I mean, one of the things that we pick up in all of our oral history interviews is the variance between what actually goes on within a presidential administration and what we're able to detect from the outside based on the reporting. And I have, you know, I have very high regard for Peter and others who are doing this work, but what they're having to rely on is usually secondhand accounts of things that are going on. One of the things that I'm really curious about with Peter, and I'll take this opportunity to pose this question to him, is about is about this, the nature of the leaking that's been going on from the administration. I mean, from the outside, those of us who are trying to get an accurate picture of what's going on within the administration feel like we're getting more information from this administration than we typically have been, because there's a lack of discipline in policing channels to the press. Is it your sense that there is more leaking going on and more substantive leaking than in your previous experience in Washington?
Yeah, it's a great question, actually. And one thing I always tell people is that reporters, I've discovered in the process of doing books and reading your oral histories and so forth, that reporters at the White House, I think we get about 20% of what's really going on at a given time in real time. We get, I think, the larger picture. We get the larger truths, the larger narratives. One thing I found is that every time I wrote a story that at the time the White House denied, later oral histories showed not only be correct, but really not even beginning to scratch the surface of it. Like, oh, there's no fight here between so-and-so and so-and-so. Not only was there a fight, there was a massive, big, giant knockdown, drag-out. So what we tend to get are tiny glimpses, you know, the tip of the iceberg, and we're not looking under the surface, Kremlinology. This White House is, in some ways, more transparent. That's not always to their liking, but they're having a lot of this thing play out in the public, and it's playing out partly through mainstream media, like my colleague Maggie Haberman has this place Wired. They all know her. She talks to them all. President himself, he hates her and loves her, can't stand her. But can't stay away from her. And it's fascinating to watch her work. I don't have the same sources she does, but she comes away with a pretty clear picture of what's going on inside in a way we hadn't before. The other thing that's different is, especially in the beginning weeks, and this is trailing off, there were a lot of holdovers, a lot of leftover folks, and there were some career people, I think, still in the administration in various places who were absolutely, did not like what was going on. Right. And willing to talk about it in ways that they might not have otherwise. And that certainly helped provide a lot of good information from our point of view.
Well, I do want to add one point on something you mentioned, and that is the degree of coverage and the amount of news that this is generating. And when I went out to my driveway this morning, we live up in Somerset, and we do get the New York Times even 25 miles out in the country here. And I opened up the front page of the Times this morning, and literally every column inch above the fold. My wife is an old newspaper person, and she said, you're probably going to have to explain to this audience what above the fold means. Nobody reads newspapers anymore, right? But the paper folds over. All of the important news is supposed to go north of that. And every column inch of that newspaper, apart from the masthead, was Trump-related news.
So I think about changing the masthead, too, yeah.
Okay. Like the Washington Post did, right?
They did, exactly. Actually, yes.
But in any event, I decided to commit an act of political science, and I went back and looked in 1981, on this very date, April the 13th, right, of 1981, to see what the front page looked like at that time, during also a very consequential transition. Would you care to guess how many column inches were devoted to Ronald Reagan or other members of his administration on the entire front page?
I mean, I want to say 0, just to really go.
It was
low.
not 0, but you lowballed me there. But you're very close.
It's my Price is Right technique.
I don't know. You're a newspaper person. What does one mention equate to?
Wow. Now that's the stunning thing, right?
One mention of Ronald Reagan. It was a casual mention. It happened to be the day that the Challenger was launching. But only one mention. And I went back and looked at the Washington Post for that same day. And there were only 5 articles in the A section of the Washington Post in any way related to the Reagan administration. I defy you to find a major newspaper these days with that little bit of reporting on this presidency. So we're fascinated by this president in particular, but we are absolutely obsessed with presidents now in a way that we've never been before. And I think a part of his genius is he understands that, and has been very successful in feeding that obsession in a way that nobody else has.
This is a reality show White House. Oh. I mean, it is a reality show White House. We've got the Bannon wing, we've got the Kushner wing, the family is out to get Bannon, and there's Reince Priebus over here. It's a reality show. And they may not, by the way, if you're a player in this and you're in these tense meetings and everything, it doesn't feel very fun. But from the outside, obviously, it has that feel.
But I think then the question is it exceptional in terms of Trump? Is this a Trump exceptionalism story? Or if you go to April 13th, 2009, is it going to be 5 stories related to the Obama administration? So I think is it a new obsession with presidents that Trump is taking advantage of, or is it a fascination with Trump that Trump is taking advantage of?
Let me tell you one thing. When I started at the White House beat in 1996, there were 2 of us on the beat, 2 reporters on my newspaper, the Washington Post at the time. By the time 9/11 happened and we had Bush and Obama, we moved it to 4 because there was just so much happening. And we had to feed the beast with the web and everything else. Today we have 6, more than any time in the history of the New York Times covering the White House, and we cannot possibly keep up.
But that's an important historical development, right? I mean, and it's important to understand that development apart from who this particular president is, because it suggests that we have a kind of obsession with the office that may in fact not be healthy. I mean, one of the great advantages of philosophically about living in a free society and a liberal democracy is that normally our lives can take place apart from any concerns about politics. I mean, the philosophers always tell you that's the great virtue of a liberal democracy, is that you don't have to stay obsessed with politics all the time. Now we're in a situation maybe where Big Brother is not watching us all the time, but we're certainly watching Big Brother all the time.
Well, and the other thing is the imbalance between branches of government, right? Yeah. And again, this is the media's fault to some extent, as much as it is the fault of the presidents who have taken advantage of this idea. But it's so much easier to focus on, cover, watch, read about one person than it is 535. Senator Warner notwithstanding, as compelling as he is, he's one of 535 members of Congress and 9 Supreme Court justices who don't do television. So it warps our understanding of the power, by the way, and makes the presidency seem more powerful than it really is. One last thing. One of George W. Bush's aides asked him in his final months in office, what surprised you, Mr. President, about being president? He said, how little power I have. Because I think we have, as a society, come to believe that presidents are almost kings, and they're not.
Well, and I think that that's a really helpful distinction that we're making by putting this in historical context, because I think one of the challenges of covering the Trump presidency is this tendency toward Trump exceptionalism, that everything he does is new and unprecedented and hasn't happened before, and it disguises the ways in which his campaign and now his administration are really building on trends that have been building up over decades.
I don't think I really have a role to play here. You guys are great. I forgot. But we've strayed a little bit away from how is Donald Trump doing in his first 100 days, and there's a tendency in these sorts of conversations for everybody to be very good-natured and try to see the best and acknowledge that just what's curious and interesting, as opposed to that there are probably a lot of people in the audience who feel right now, and there are probably others in the audience who feel the opposite, but I think there are probably a lot of people here who think that the country's going to hell in a handbasket, and that we're... and that these are dangerous times. And so, I am really interested in, from any of you, just, whether you see it that, how do you see the president's performance? But also in terms of, and I'll throw this to Peter first, in terms of this sort of chaotic start. Now, this is going to be an easy one for you, actually. It has been a chaotic start for President Trump. We're now seeing what do appear to be some reshaping of the White House and what his team is going to look like. On the one hand, you can look at that and say, my God, no one's in charge. His son-in-law is actually the chief of staff and maybe the Secretary of State, or maybe not.
Both.
Or both. On the other hand, I remember back to the beginning of the Clinton administration. That's one that we actually now is generally remembered as a very successful presidency, aside from some of the scandals. But the beginning of the Clinton presidency was a disaster. Chief of staff was a best friend from back in Arkansas who was a great guy, but not a very effective chief of staff. Lots of chaos, lots of essentially being suckered by the particularly right-wing media at the time and getting caught up in other people's narratives, other people's stories, and really a pretty disastrous-looking beginnings to a presidency. But then they got it together. They found their legs, and whether you like it or not, fulfilled an agenda that pretty effectively for President Clinton. So are we What are the odds that, however messy this 100 days has been, that there's actually something emerging from this that is a more serious and predictable presidency?
You know, I think that's a great question. Somebody tweeted today, would you have imagined in the first 100 days of Richard Nixon that by the end of his time he would have had an opening to China? Like nobody would have said, this is what I think is going to happen in the next 6 years. So I do think we should be very careful about making predictions. And that's one thing I've learned to my own chagrin even in the last few weeks again, is every time I've made a prediction about this White House, I've been wrong. So stay out of the prediction game. We don't know, obviously. We're seeing pivoting and adjusting and recalibrating by, I don't even say by the day, by the hour. I mean, it's just, and it's hard to even, just yesterday alone, he said, remember that thing I told you about NATO being obsolete? Not so much. They fixed themselves. It's only been 80 days, but they fixed themselves. Well, okay, all right. And that whole thing about, I told you just last week how China is the world champion currency manipulator. Not so much. They're not really manipulating. So it's just mind-boggling. And as we were talking about in the Fox Business News interview, he said, you know, that Obama, he really should have bombed Syria in 2013 when they had that chemical weapons attack. What a big mistake. Never mind that he told them not to in 2013.
Over and over again, right?
It's hard to keep up. And think about some of the things that have happened in this first, not even 100 days. The president fired the acting attorney general. He fired his own national security advisor. He did put a Supreme Court justice on the court. By the way, that was a below-the-fold story the day it happened, because so many other things were happening that day. You know, we had this extraordinary investigation that Senator Warner was talking about into, you know, an unprecedented meddling in our election by a foreign power. We're now having kinetic action, military action against Syria. We had this giant bomb today in Afghanistan. You can't even stop to absorb. Forget the healthcare legislation, what happens with tax reform. You can't. He's had a fight with the courts already. Remember, that now feels 1,000 years ago. But the President of the United States referred to judges as so-called judges and so forth. So we can't even stop to absorb any of these individual things because we're so busy moving to the next thing.
I would say that, first of all, I completely co-sign the no predictions thing. I think it gives people this sense that they know what's going to happen, which is obviously a false sense of what's going to happen. But there are things that we do know based on the first 80 or so days that he's been in office. And one of those things is that he is willing to go forward with some of the policies that people saw as particularly harmful, whether it was deportation squads or whether it was banning refugees and banning immigrants from Muslim countries. Like we've seen that. But we've also learned, I think, something about Trump that maybe we didn't know. And that is that people have talked about him as having flexibility, that he's flexible in his doctrine. But I actually think that's the wrong word. I think he's malleable. So I think that he's not changing from within, but he's being changed from without. So he learns new information like China-Korea relations or that healthcare is challenging, and he changes his positions. And the reason that that is important is because it's not an internal flexibility. It's what he heard last. And I think that actually makes him easier to manipulate than if he were simply flexible. And I think that we don't know what's going to happen with that. We can't predict what his policy preferences are going to end up being. But I think it's why it's important that we know who he's surrounded by and the kinds of conversations he's having, because those conversations have outsized policy effects, because that new information changes fundamentally what he thinks he should do as president.
Yeah, I think one of the really interesting things in watching this president is trying to figure out exactly how the institution of the presidency is shaping his behavior. I mean, he came out of the campaign as basically a wrecking ball. I mean, this is a guy who was a developer. He understood the value of a wrecking ball, but that's not the end all and be all of development. Once you clear the lot, you've got to figure out what you're going to put on it. And we didn't get very much in the way of blueprints for things beyond that. So the question as president is how much of a wrecking ball can you continue to be? And if that's not where you're going to leave your mark, you have to be building something. And we still don't know what that is. He goes back and forth from taxes to health care and other matters. And I think part of the reason we pay so much attention to personnel within the White House is because that has the effect of shaping what we think ultimately we can expect from him, and we just don't know yet.
Well, that sounds a little bit like some of what we heard in terms of discussion during the campaign of the idea that however much of a disruptor candidate Obama said he was going to be as president, it does turn out, every president learns this, that turning the ship of state in any direction is a very complicated thing, and the institutions that make up the government, and it's not just the deep, dark secret state, the deep state that we're talking about, but just the normal function of government. It's hard to change everything overnight, and President Obama has obviously, President Obama learned this lesson too, but the President
It's
Trump.
so hard to tell them apart.
It is hard to tell them apart, you know. Yeah. But both have a certain ruddy complexion. But the most dangerous comment of the night. But yeah, it's hard to transform the government, no matter even with a mandate as President Obama had, and with with something of a split decision that President Trump had. Would you agree with that? You know, that it's confronting these institutions that are a big part of why thus far he has not seemed to be able to.
Look, you have to remember, you cannot forget that he is the first president in American history who has zero experience in government or the military. The first one. And that's a good thing as far as his base is concerned. That's why a lot of people voted for him. Finally, we get the wrecking ball. But it means he doesn't understand yet how it works. And he surrounded himself with a lot of people who also don't have experience. Reince Priebus, Jared Kushner, Steve Bannon, Rex Tillerson, Seth Mnuchin. I mean, like a lot of the people around him, Kellyanne Conway, have never been in government before either. So they don't understand why Congress has to do health care before tax reform. And they don't understand why they should have all the cabinet agencies look at this travel ban before you put it out to the public. And a lot of these things are a learning curve, and he is learning. And we'll see whether the learning then leads to a different type, a more settled down type of governance that actually produces results or not.
Peter, one of the most inexplicable things to me in looking at this administration is the unwillingness of the president and senior White House officials to flesh out the government. I mean, to fill all of these senior positions. What we've been taught from political science 101 on, and certainly is amply evident in the oral history interviews we conduct, is that if a president wants to have an impact on the bureaucracy or on what they refers to as the deep state, if you want to fix the deep state, you know how you do it? You put your people in positions of authority over those bureaucracies in order to make sure that they're disciplined in the way that you want them to be. It's mind-boggling that they haven't seen or understood that. Now, his critics would say it's fantastic because it means that he's inept and he can't carry out his agenda. But as a scholar and as somebody who's trying to examine this from a sort of clinical perspective, it's just inexplicable why you wouldn't understand you've got to have your people in the government to carry out your policies.
Yeah, my editor at U.S. News said the problem isn't the deep state, it's the shallow state. It's the fact that there's nobody in these agencies to actually implement the things that Trump ultimately wants to implement. And if he doesn't want like the EPA to do anything, then it's fine that there's no one there. But when it comes to state, I mean, we have a Secretary of State and no undersecretaries, no undersecretaries, no deputies, no one. And if you want to implement a foreign policy, if his foreign policy has shifted from non-interventionism to interventionism, there's not a ton he can do because he hasn't staffed the State Department.
Yeah, no, and exactly. And it is curious. Now, he'll tell you it's all the Senate's fault for not confirming his people. But the truth is he hasn't sent people up to the Senate. He just hasn't. I mean, they're very, very slow at this. And at its core is this idea of loyalty, right? They have shrunk their own natural Republican pool of talent because they won't take anybody who was a never-Trumper or even simply said something bad about President Trump last year during the campaign. And then another section of the Republican Party doesn't want to have anything to do with it because it's either it seems to be a disaster in the making, or they're ideologically at odds with them, or what have you. So the number of people they have to pick from is already a pretty small pool. And then the vetting has been tough. And what's happened is you've seen repeatedly now people who actually were hired into jobs, not Senate-confirmed jobs, but jobs in the government, important jobs, like you say, and suddenly a week or two later they're frog-marched out of there because somebody discovered a clip from last year where they said something bad about Trump. So this has really caused a backlog in the hiring at this point.
So what should we be watching for as citizens and readers and viewers what should we be watching for in terms of signals as to the moment that President Trump is at risk of having his Republican allies, or needs to be allies, in Congress begin to abandon him or become fearful of him in the same way that Democrats essentially paralyzed President Obama in 2010 when they began to run away from him, much to their ill effect for their own party. But what should we be watching for in terms of whether there's a breaking point that President Trump has to get to a certain place, has to accomplish certain things, or he's at risk of having members of the House begin campaigning aggressively and not mentioning him, and having people like, I think John Kasich is basically running for president already, coming out with a new book in a few minutes. But how soon do we have the next presidential, the Republican primaries beginning, and the Republican members of the House running away from him? What do we watch for as the trigger wires that would suggest that's happening?
Well, I would say one thing that we need to watch for is, instead of looking at his overall approval rating, you just have to keep an eye on the Republican-Democratic breakdown, because as long as 80% of Republicans support Donald Trump, you're not going to have a Republican Congress running away from him. If and when those numbers plummet, that will create space for Republicans in the Congress to run away from Trump. But at the moment, I suspect, I'd be interested in what you all think, but I suspect that a lot of Republicans in the Congress see it as a pretty short window that they're going to have to actually get legislation through and on the president's desk and get it signed before the presidency becomes so toxic that they're not going to have that option anymore, that his unpopularity is going to drag them down as well. So that actually keeps them in line a little bit, because they know that they need to stay together to take advantage of an ever-shrinking window with Trump.
Yeah, I think that the thing that's important to remember too, I think you're exactly right. I think the thing that's important to remember too is there's no well of goodwill for him. There's no reservoir of goodwill for him among Republicans in Washington. Remember, he ran against Republicans in some ways in Washington almost as much as he did against Democrats. He's a destroyer of the establishment. And so I can't think of people in Congress who are Trump people. You know what I mean? I've tried to figure it out. Who are the congressmen I can call to say, they'll stay by him for now because it's in their interest, but there's not like some, passion for him that would keep them loyal to him if they see their own self-interest changing.
Yeah, what I'm paying attention to is the facts on the ground. That, my sense is that people who had faith in him, particularly the Trump voters, particularly in the Deep South where I know people and you know people, Doug, that they will stick with him. They were with him at the beginning because he wasn't Hillary Clinton. I think that's the largely unstated fact of this election. And the fact of his governance is he doesn't have much of an agenda, because most of the agenda was, well, at least he's not Hillary Clinton, which is why the Supreme Court appointment, I think, was so important. But I think where you begin to see a cascading off of Republican voters is instances where the unemployment rate starts creeping up, where the interest rates start creeping up, where you have unforeseen events that begin to take a toll on his polling because of his inability to be deft in using the government to deal with it. If you get a hurricane through the Deep South again, those are the kinds of things that I think would cause his support to cascade. And I still think he's facing terrific headwinds, maybe not in the congressional elections, but for re-election he would be facing really terrific headwinds.
We've just got a couple more minutes for us to talk, and then we're going to take questions from the audience, and I think there are folks out with microphones. If you've got a question to ask, look around and see if you can spot one of the microphone runners. But before we do that, a quick one to you, Peter, and then a last question for all of you. The quick one is, I'm an old Wall Street Journal guy. I spent most of 20 years there, and the Journal's had an unpleasant time in the media lately in this discussion, both internally and externally, about whether it's been too soft on Trump or not. And Murdoch's man, who now runs the paper, his statement about the use of the word lie, and his position that you shouldn't use the word lie automatically about false statements because it implies an intention to deceive. But what's the message inside the New York Times about lie or false statement, or how to deal with these things?
Boy, okay, that's a great question. Can I have a lifeline? Can I call? That's a decision made by my editor, Dean Baquet. He's the executive editor of the New York Times, and he has made the decision on, I think, 3 occasions, where the New York Times has used the word lie in a headline, I believe, in relation to something that the president or a candidate had said. I'm very cautious on this. I'm very old school on this. I'm sympathetic to the idea that we should be very careful about presuming what somebody is thinking, and that falsehood is something you can say based on facts. Lie does imply intent. And so I'm very cautious and conservative about what we should do on things like that. Having said that, there are certainly instances where you can point to where the president or some other person has said something repeatedly, been corrected, knows it's wrong, and says it again, in which case it's probably justified. And, that takes the New York Times in a place where it hadn't been before. It's not something we generally tend to do because we're very uncomfortable inserting ourselves like that because it makes us more of an umpire than we want to be. But these are times that require us to be as straight as we possibly can with our readers, so we're trying to do that.
So last thing here we are. I share that view, by the way. I was actually, even though Jerry Baker, the Murdoch guy I was talking about, and I didn't always get along, I actually thought that
no relation, just to be.
Well, that's true, exactly. Good, glad we pointed that out, in different accents, because you can only run the Wall Street Journal now if you have a certain accent. But
it's not your accent.
Not mine. So I'd be curious to hear from all of you, and then we'll take some questions on this. Now that it's established, and the president's actually pretty comfortable with, and the people around him are comfortable with, including his, some of his spokespeople, that we're not supposed to actually take literally the things that he says, and that's openly stated advice to all of us. And so it's sort of established that for all of us that oftentimes the president is going to say things that are not factually correct. And so if we all kind of know that there's a good chance the president is saying things that are untrue, does it matter whether they are true?
Yes. I mean, it's a philosophical but also a political question. Like, truth matters. Because ultimately, reality comes knocking at your door. Ultimately, it matters that you can't cut the cost of healthcare and still provide better healthcare. You can't cover more people by covering fewer people. Like, those things don't work. And so the facts on the ground do come home to roost eventually. And it matters because our readers and as citizens, we live in a democracy that requires an informed public. And if we're not doing our jobs as historians and scholars and journalists to inform the public, especially when the official messages coming out of the administration are untrue, then we're not just letting down readers, we're letting down our democracy.
Well said. And it is worth, and either Russell or Peter weigh in on some of the specifics of this, but there are the things like that if the strongman leader of another country believes that he has received a message from the leadership of the United States that it's okay to take over an adjoining country, and that the United States won't object to that, and then Kuwait is consumed by Iraq because Saddam Hussein misunderstood the message, then yes, the consequences can be quite enormous. So it's more than just the symbolic nature of truth, but nonetheless. We've been told don't assume that it's all facts coming from the president. Does that change the nature of these communications in some way? I mean, if he has told us don't expect it all to be true, then does that grant him a kind of latitude that no president's ever had before?
No, I think it's our job as media and certainly as scholars to scrutinize this president like we scrutinized every president before. And I'm sorry, we do take you literally. You had the biggest microphone, you had the biggest bullhorn in the world, and words matter. This is not, and why I joked earlier about it being a reality television show. It's not entertainment. It is real. And so it matters if the President of the United States accuses his predecessor of wiretapping and with no proof whatsoever. It matters if you say 3 million people, mystery phantom voters, showed up at the polls and voted illegally and cost you the popular vote with no evidence whatsoever. These things matter, and we're not going to shrink from, I think, scrutinizing those and telling our readers what we can best tell them based on our factual reporting is the truth as we can determine it. And that's our job. And we are an independent part of society. And that's, I think, clearer and more necessary than ever, that people have some place they can go to. I live around the corner from a pizza shop in Washington, D.C., where I take my son. And a lot of you have probably heard this story. And there was some nonsensical story on the internet about how a pedophilia ring was being run out of this pizza shop, right? I take my son there. And a guy shows up one day with a gun to rescue all these poor kids who were being, in this pedophilia ring, which of course does not exist. And he fired a shot. He's been arrested and everything. Thank God nothing worse happened. But again, my son and I go there. And it reminds you again, truth matters. It matters. You have to know where to go for real truth. Don't believe the nonsense. Go to places that you trust, that have a record of honesty and factual information, and check everything yourself, because it's too important for all of us.
President's words are very powerful things. And I told a friend of mine in advance of this event during the transition period, I said, a president who does not understand the power of his words is like a 6-year-old in possession of a handgun with a bullet in it. You may be able to get by without there being any problems whatsoever for an extended period of time, but at some point, disaster could happen.
I said that would be the last thing, but there's one bonus question I've just got to ask Peter before we turn to you guys. And that is, but a really serious question. When the President of the United States, given the importance of his words, as you guys have all just said, when the President of the United States says that you, Peter Baker, are an enemy of the American people and the rest of your organization, and we can chuckle about that, but that's a very serious thing. And particularly to say about people who really genuinely believe that you're maybe one of the most important friends of the American people over history. How do you not want to sort of even the score with the president when something like that has been said?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And we're not enemies of the people. The fact that I have to say that is kind of crazy. We feel like our role in society makes for a healthier democracy, and it can make for, by the way, a healthier presidency as well. And it's not particular to this one. But at the same time, it's a political thing. He needs an enemy. We are a good enemy. Everybody hates the media. Nobody lost a vote attacking the media. Never. And the Democrats aren't really, on their feet yet. And so he wants to make the media an enemy because it's better as a politician, at least some politicians, certainly this one, to have an enemy to fight instead of just being responsible for yay or nay, whether the economy is doing well or whether the country is doing well. So we are a convenient enemy in that sense. From my point of view, our response should be, we're not your enemy. We're not the enemy of the people. We're not the opposition. We are an independent part of society that has a professional job to do, and we should be professionals and not be drawn into it. It's a bait. We're being baited, and we shouldn't be baited into this, because otherwise then we become part of a political strategy rather than doing our jobs. And our job should be journalism.
Great. So do we have a question from the audience? All right, I see a microphone moving over there. All right. We're only going to go like 2 more hours. Is everybody okay with that? And then we're headed down to Whiskey Jar. First round's on me. If only a few people come. Okay, there we go. We got a microphone arriving.
Thank you so much, and thank you all of you for doing what you do, especially Peter and Nikki for being in the media, and I know it's not an easy job right now, so thank you. My question's about authenticity, and I know there's been this sort of obsession since the Trump election about candidates who are authentic and who speak their minds, and it applied to Bernie, it applied to Trump, and it applies to a couple of other, people in the realm right now. And I'm wondering if you think there's going to be a backlash from that. Does authenticity come with costs in terms of telling the truth, in terms of being accurate, and are we sacrificing sort of civil discourse for more authentic or more real dialogue? And do you think that the authenticity craze is going to go away? And so that's my question. Thank you.
Well, I think that authenticity, I mean, it's something that didn't just appear on the stage, right, with the Trump presidency, that it's been this real backlash against sort of overly controlled and overly groomed, manicured politicians for decades, right? This idea that you could use television in JFK's era, or that Jimmy Carter was this plain-spoken man from Georgia who was more authentic and even ran against Washington as a Democrat to say, you know, I'm not tainted by Washington. I'm a more authentic person in that way. Bill Clinton going on MTV or Arsenio Hall. This fight to appear authentic has been a really important part of running for president for a couple of decades now. What's interesting is where we've landed, where there has been kind of a divergence between authenticity and truth-telling, that the ability to say something offensive or crass or, oh my gosh, I can't believe he just said that, that feels more authentic than something that's true. And that division is really interesting. And I think that's a broader cultural problem that has to do with, I mean, we've talked about Trump as a reality television president, but that's actually truer than you would think, because that is kind of the genre of reality television, right? Scripted reality. And in many ways, that's what we're butting up against, is the appearance of authenticity without necessarily being rooted in truth. But you probably have other thoughts.
No, I agree with that. I think there's a difference between authenticity and incivility, right? I don't think being civil is unauthentic or inauthentic. Professor, help me. And I think that
It's past my bedtime.
where my copy desk is not here. But George W. Bush, like him or not, was an authentic guy, and his authenticity helped him beat Al Gore, who did not seem authentic. That may not have been completely fair, but that was, I think, the reality. But George W. Bush would never do or say a lot of the things that Donald Trump does or say, because the Bush family ethos was not, name calling and that sort of thing. Now, somebody asked me the other day, has the genie been taken out of the bottle? Does that mean from now on we're always going to have, presidents who do and say things like this one does? I don't think so, because I don't think any other politician is getting away with it. You don't see Mike Pence out there suddenly, mixing it up like that. You don't. I mean, it's just not. It's not authentic to him. That's not who he is, right? And I think there may be the next president, Republican or Democrat, may make a virtue out of being, not Donald Trump, because in fact, David Axelrod, who was President Obama's chief strategist, says that we look for a remedy, not a replica, in the next president, right? So after Clinton, we were looking for somebody who wasn't going to be a scalawag in the Oval Office, and we picked George W. Bush because he was going to withhold the honor of the office. After Bush, we were tired of the Texas swagger, so we looked for kind of a Ivy League, very reserved fella in Obama. After Obama, we were looking for the exact opposite guy, and we picked Trump. So I sort of feel like the next one might be the opposite of him.
And I think that there is a tendency to over-interpret elections, and particularly in this case, because again, maybe this is because I spent so much time working with the Clintons in doing the oral history work and producing books and scholarly articles out of that experience. But I think this is very much an anti-Clinton election, even more than it was a pro-Trump election. And therefore, particularly when we're so immersed in what's going on in the White House right now, it's very difficult to look back and understand that maybe this is just a weird, exceptional thing that happened. We're paying the consequences for it, but you have to be very careful then not to overinterpret it. Freud is reputed to have said at one point, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. So we don't have to get...
So to speak.
Doug, you're...
Do we have another question from the audience, or I'm going to... I'm not going to
Please don't let
explain
that
my
be the
cigar
last
reference. Let's see, if we get a microphone over here
Yes.
when nearby, okay.
The question is, many voters were concerned that this president might get us into a war of some level, small or big, and so far they've done 4 things, One is said they're going to reduce the State Department dramatically. They then put more troops in Syria, used the largest non-nuclear bomb in our arsenal, and sent an armada, as they called it, to South China Sea off Korea. Where could this be leading?
Oh, golly. Yeah, you know, it's really, I can't tell you, right? Did I say what I said about predictions? He did say in the election campaign that he thought we ought to stop being quite so militaristic around the world, right? Except for beating the X out of ISIS, he said, you know, that Bush and Obama were getting us into too many other people's wars, Libya, Iraq, and so on. And yet now you're right. We seem to be in a very aggressive posture right now. You left out Yemen, for instance, where they've had more operations in the last few weeks than in years there, and some of the rules have been changed to provide more opportunity for that. So I don't know. You know, and I think one of the things that he has fostered, President Trump has fostered, is this idea of unpredictability. So we don't know, right? And remember, Richard Nixon had what he called the madman philosophy. His philosophy was, you tell him, he told Kissinger, you tell him that you can't control this crazy president you've got, and they better do what you're asking them to do, otherwise you never know what Nixon's going to do. For him, it was calculation, right? It was a thought-through strategy, maybe nutty, but it was a thought-through strategy. We don't know, I don't know yet, and we may not know until Russell does the oral history some days down the road, whether this is a thought-through situation where they're trying to scare the North Koreans into thinking they might do something they're not willing to do, or whether there's a genuine willingness to do something. I don't know. That's one of the central questions of this presidency.
Is whether or not it's the madman theory without the theory.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Well, but I think,
as the approach to use of military force in the world.
right, and I think that this actually is, we can't predict because of how rapidly his foreign policy ideas have changed in office. And this is where I think the malleability thing comes into play, is that one of the more unusual things that Trump brought into office was at least a rhetorical commitment in some ways to, if not non-interventionism, then to less interventionism. But he is largely surrounded by interventionists. And so if it is true that he can be talked into just about anything, he probably will be more interventionist than he sounded on the campaign trail. Now, how he will be restrained and what will actually happen, of course, we can't say it all. But there's definitely not a core, at least there doesn't appear to be a core set of foreign policy principles that we could predict off of.
Yeah, Nikki, I think you're right about that. The only thing that I would point to is that the one area where clearly the grown-ups have moved more fully into the orbit of decision-making has been in the foreign policy arena. And I don't know enough about the individuals in that area to comment on them, other than to say that in my experience in doing interviews over many administrations, the military people tend to be among the most conservative in terms of the use of force abroad because of their understanding of what's actually involved in the consequences. So that may actually be a good development in this administration.
it's also the case, though, that I think that the most under-discussed dimension of President Trump's history, and this sounds like a bit of a joke, but it's a serious observation, is that we have come to a real understanding of him as a real estate developer, and that then he was in reality TV, but it was a kind of business-oriented reality TV. But he also was this incredibly active business person in terms of beauty pageants and wrestling. You know, and I mean in terms of a sense of how the audience responds, the idea that his instincts really align with the way wrestling works, that you have to answer every affront, and the idea that, you know, one dramatic throw can win everything on this one night, and the next night you can start all over again and declare a whole new champion. I really do think that we can see a lot into his mechanics of his thinking through wrestling.
I would add one more thing, which is interesting. I like that, actually. I would add one more thing. We've talked a lot about his Twitter account in this 80 days because it feels so impulsive. It feels so random sometimes, and it feels as he was like a 6-year-old or something like that. At times, kind of can't let something go, can't not respond to Senator Schumer said something or whatever, I'm going to hit him back. What you haven't seen in the 1 week we've now gone since the cruise missile strike is a single tweet trolling Bashar al-Assad or Vladimir Putin, right? He's not got there and say, hey, badass Bashar, I'm on your case or whatever. He has not, you know what I mean? He's not, right? That's sort of his shtick. And it suggests a discipline that we hadn't really associated with this, that in fact maybe there is a plan here, maybe it is more thought through, however unconventional it might be, than we had anticipated, because he's not actually goading either Bashar al-Assad or Vladimir Putin through the use of Twitter, which he will do with almost anybody inside the borders of the United States should he feel offended in some way.
Well, you guys have been great. The clock is telling us that, that we are out of time, but thank you all. It's really been wonderful. Thank all of you. They were a great audience.